Hey guys, Drew from Tacx, and in this video we are going to discuss the tools and techniques used to perform bearing maintenance on your Neo unit and its various parts. Right now we are going to talk just about bearings tools, and in the other videos we'll talk about what additional tools you'll need to disassemble Neo to get to the bearings in the first place. There are a lot of different ways to remove and install bearings, so I'm going to touch briefly on them from most barbaric to least barbaric and why you might choose one technique over another. As with other majority of things that I personally recommend with respect to Neo, the goal is to ensure your safety as well as that of your Neo and your tools. So there really isn't a right and a wrong here, but some techniques are less error prone, so that's the direction that we're generally going to lean. Also in this video, I'm going to assume that you have no prior knowledge. So first I want to give you a very brief tour on the anatomy of bearings as well as the various parts of Neo so that we're all comfortable with the terminology that you're going to hear in this and other videos where we are walking through the actual process of changing the bearings. We really wanted to have Hambini join us for this portion of the video, but as some of you might already know, Hambini was in a cycling accident with a taxi a few days ago and is not available to make an appearance. We definitely wish him a very speedy recovery and hope that he will be able to join us and call us a bunch of bags soon. Until then, we're on our own, so let's get to it. The only parts in Neo which contain bearings are the free hub and the Neo disc, and these have two bearings each for all versions of Neo and free hubs. All the bearings in Neo are cartridge bearings, which simply means the bearing is a single unit and can't be disassembled without destroying it. When we were talking about bearings in our context, we mean cartridge bearings. All of the bearings in Neo are double sealed, so you will see a seal on both sides, which keeps the lubricant in and keeps any contaminants out. They are also radial, so there is no inside or outside, so you don't have to worry about placing them in a specific orientation, but often you're going to see text on the seals or etched in the races, which should face outward from the service perspective so that you can find the part numbers more easily. So bearings like these have two important parts that we're going to be concerned with, and that is the inner race and the outer race, which is this part here. So because these are radial bearings, they're designed to withstand load that is perpendicular to the axle. So when you push or pull on either the inner race or outer race relative to the other, so if this is fixed and you're pulling here, or the inside is fixed and you're pulling on the outside, you're introducing axial load, which these types of bearings are not designed to endure. And by doing so, you will almost certainly damage the bearing. So when you're removing a Neo bearing, you will be pulling or pushing on the inner race, so you should presume that once you've removed the bearing by whichever method, you've damaged the bearing and probably shouldn't reuse it. So if you want to practice your installation technique, practice on your old bearings and not your new ones. So bearings are installed in a housing which matches the outer diameter of the bearing within a couple of microns and holds it tightly without the use of adhesives or adjustable tension. So within the housing is a boss, which is a little protrusion that allows you to install the bearing to a very exact depth without wondering if you've installed it too far or not far enough. So the cheapest way to remove a bearing is with a punch and a hammer. So for parts like Neo main hub, where a clear view of the interior is accessible, you can literally just knock it straight out by tapping around the inner race a little at a time until it falls out. The downside of this technique is that the force is not distributed evenly around the race, so you may get the bearing stuck in the housing, break the inner race, or gouge the inside of the housing with your tools. One of the other tools commonly used for removing bearings is a blind hole bearing puller. None of the Neo parts are blind holes, which basically means that all the holes of Neo parts go all the way through, but you can still use one of these. Essentially, a set like this will come with a slide hammer and some collets. The collet fits down in the bearing. I'm just going to show you that real quick. like that. I'll give you a different view. And the fingers of the collet, as you tighten this, the fingers expand to press against the inner race of the bearing. So you can see here, the collet has a slight lip at the bottom edge, and that's the part that grabs the inside of the inner race. You then use the slide hammer to pull the bearing out. The downside of a blind hole puller is that you have to manage both the part by holding it down and the tool while lifting it up at the same time. So with small parts like a free hub body or very tight bearings, this isn't very easy. And I've also seen guys smack themselves in the face when the part suddenly lets go. Additionally, there are varying degrees of quality for these types of collets, where the cheap Amazon versions will have asymmetrical fingers that push the collet to one side or another, and we really want to keep everything as level and centered as possible. So the blind hole puller that I use is from Enduro, and it is among the nicest sets in the world, but it's also pricey. This is the set that all the knockoffs are based upon, which is why they all look very similar. So if you look at these, the collets are extremely precise and perfectly symmetrical. So if you're looking for pro quality tools, this is it. So next we have sealed bearing extractors, which are very similar to collets in function in that they have these little expanding joints, but instead of pulling the extractor out with a slide hammer, you either push it out with an arbor press or hydraulic press, or tap it out with a pin punch. Tighten this guy up. This in my hand is one of my favorite tools. It's a combination adjustable wrench and grip, and it basically becomes a second hand for you. Tighten that up real quick. The advantage of this technique is that gravity is on your side, and you only need to buy the individual parts that match your bearings. So for example, for all the bearings for Neo OG and Neo 2, you would only need the 15 millimeter and the 25 millimeter extractor. The downside of this approach is that when you've pressed out the bearing, like this, it's going to fall to the floor along with any spacers that were behind it. And if you have a lot of machinery in your shop, you may be playing hide and go seek with the parts that have bounced and rolled away. So I always recommend having a catch bin with some shop rags so the parts stay put and don't bounce away. The extractors that I use are from Wheels Manufacturing, one of the top companies in the world for bicycle small parts and tools. And finally is the bearing press, which can be employed in a few different ways to remove and install bearings with the aid of bearing drifts or bearing guides. The nice thing about the bearing press is that everything is kept very orderly, contained, straight, and centered, so you don't have to worry much about misalignment. So let me just show you how that works. Make a little sandwich out of this by putting the drift on, putting the part on that matches the drift, and then putting the part on that matches the bearing, and it all goes together like a nice little sandwich, and it can't move anywhere. Essentially, a bearing press is a threaded rod with a fixed end and a rotating end. You can make one of these pretty inexpensively with some threaded rod washers and nuts from the hardware center, but I recommend against that approach because you will not have a great result. So if you look at the design of this particular bearing press, you can see that it has a Delrin bearing of its own here. And this allows, I'm going to just draw a little line so you can see this. This allows the pressing portion here to remain fixed against the drift and avoids problems like galling or rotation in the bearing housing. In the video for free hub bodies, we'll be using a hybrid approach to remove bearings that use both a bearing extractor and a bearing press. For installation of bearings, a bearing press and appropriately sized drifts like this are really all you need for perfect installations. And this is how we will be installing all of our bearings in our videos. If you don't have the right drifts, though, you can make a huge mess of things by pressing the bearing in crooked. So for the installation of bearings, it's pretty important that the bearing goes in straight. So while there are a number of ways to achieve this, I really recommend against using a punch, mallet, or even another bearing to smash the bearings in. So for my own hubs and for my customers, I'll always use the suggested using a bearing press for the best results. And so there you have it, guys. Intro to Bearing Maintenance 101. Next up, we're going to start from a fully assembled Neo and show you how to change the free hub bearings, and then we'll move on to the main disc bearings in the next video. In those videos, we're going to break down every part number and tool and tell you exactly what you'll need for Neo, Neo 2, and Neo 2T. Hope this information gets you started in the right direction. Thanks for checking out our videos. That's all for now, and we'll see you soon.